Greetings. Today I'd like to do a little video about the Allen Heath AHM-32 matrix processor and a couple of the accessories for it. The Dante cards for SQ and AHM are finally shipping after having it on back order for basically a year and a half. And so now I've been able to sort of fully realize my AHM config. I also have an IP8 controller for it, which we'll talk a little bit about as well. If you haven't seen any of my other videos, I do a lot with Dante. It's my primary means for all of my audio routing and whatnot. And I use the Army Digiface interface cards for both of my computers. The Army is actually a really powerful interface, more than an interface. It's got an FPGA in it that does mixing. It will create a separate mix for every output. So you can, there's 128 possible outputs if you've got both Dante and MADI going, 256 total inputs. Any output can use one or any of the inputs. So it's quite a powerful matrix mixer. The one issue it has is that it does not have any EQ or dynamics processing like some of the other Army interfaces do. And that's probably because to do that for that many channels would be a lot of DSP and or FPGA and make the device prohibitively expensive for their target market. And I've lived with that for quite a while, but I've always wanted to have the ability to do a little of that EQ and dynamics. And so that's what interested me in the AHM series from Allen and Heath. They've got three models in the series. Started with the 64 channel unit, which is 2 rack units, and I think they're around $4,500 or something like that. It's probably gone up given all the price increases, throughout and after COVID. And then a year and a half ago, they announced, and then probably a year ago, they started shipping the AHM-32 and the AHM-16, which are 32 and 16 channel versions. And I actually have the AHM-32, not because I really need 32 channels here, but mainly because it was the one that shipped first. And the AHM-32 and the AHM-16 are a good bit less expensive than the 64, because the 64 does some extra things that they don't. And my AHM-32 showed up and has not really been in use very much. Because I had to hook it up via the analog ports it's got on it, which is not really ideal, while waiting forever for the Dante card. And now the Dante card is here. I have reconfigured it to use the Dante card, and I figured I'd give a walkthrough of how I've got it. This is a fairly simple setup, but maybe gives you an idea of some of the things you can do with the AHM series. I could recreate all of the mixes that I have in Digiface Dante on it. I have not done that at this time, partly because I've been using them for so long and they work. And to do mix minus for things like connection for the mobile phone and or the IP phones, etc., don't really need EQ or dynamics on them. The EQ dynamics would be applied to the microphones, and that I can do with the AHM. So the processing logic here, and why don't I switch over to the computer, and I'm also gonna zoom this in on the IP8 for when we get to the IP8 stuff. So all right, so I'm over on the computer, and let me bring the mic in a little bit. And it's a little in this frame, but oh well. The main computer is this one here. And forgive that it still says Roadcaster, because I never renamed it, because changing names causes Dante to confuse itself and you have to redo all your routing, and I just never bothered to do that. And what you can see is I've got 2 zones that I've created in the AHM. One of them I've set up as a stereo zone. The second I have set up as a mono zone, and I will get to that in a moment when we start looking at the AHM config itself. And actually, before we do that, this is the AHM-32. It's a rack mount processor. That's why you're not looking at it. It's kind of boring. 32 by 32. It's got 12 by 12 local analog. One of the things they added versus the 64 on the 16 and 32 is some soft buttons on the front. I have configured one of those to be like a panic reset everything button. We'll get to that a little bit later. Got the I/O port with the Dante card in it. Dante only does 64 by 64. You can sort of see the I/O port here in their photo. It's kind of dark, right? But you can see the screws for it. And then all of the analog I/O is on Phoenix chip blocks. You've got the network port. The other thing you can do with the Dante card is it's got a network switch in it, so you can enable that. And then you can have the primary network also carry the control for the AHM-32, and the secondary port is then, you can either run it in switched mode or in redundant mode. I run all my stuff in redundant mode. So I've got a primary and a secondary network. We'll see that in a bit as well. At any rate, you can go, this is the link up here. You can go check it out if you want. So again, in Dante Controller, the routing here is that I've got zone 1 left and right coming into the main input on the digiface. This is what the mic you're hearing me on, and can do a few other things we'll get to in a moment. Zone 2 is then going into this merge in, which again gets pulled into various mixes on the digiface, and you'll see why in a bit. And then up here on the AHM-32 itself, we've got, I renamed the channels here. We've got these 3 inputs. These are coming from the main on each of my Studio Technologies Model 234 announcer consoles, right? So I use this main one on the office desk for myself, and then I have 2 others that guests can use when they're over. You've never seen a guest on the YouTube channel because I'm doing that more for work-related stuff, but I have a total of these 3 Studio Technologies announcers consoles, and they're being fed into inputs 1, 2, and 3 on the AHM. If we look at the AHM, it announces itself as this SQ Dante V3 because, again, it's the new card that just started shipping. And as you can see here, it's got HC. HC is basically what Dante has done is, or what Allen and Heath has done is they've licensed the Dante code from Autonate, so they're not using a Brooklyn or other chip, they're using their own chip. And one of the nice things about that is that if you look at the flow information, you can see that instead of a Brooklyn, which would only have 64 flows, you've actually got 128 flows on this Dante card. And then as you can see, it's configured for static addresses on the primary and secondary Dante networks. Latency is set for 500 milliseconds, and it has no trouble achieving that on the network here. I did set the card to 48 kilohertz because that's what the rest of my Dante network is. And then here you can see that latency setting. So we will close up Dante Controller. And now down here, we have the AHM Systems Manager. So because it's an embedded device, it's meant for like installations. It doesn't really have a user interface or a control panel of its own, right? Instead, you program everything through this software app And the software app has this main window, and you can pop out this secondary window, and that allows you to do stuff. So like if we're in assign and monitoring, as I hover over various points in the input chain and the output chains, which is what are the zones, you can see that down here, this monitor point changes as I move around, so you can see where you're monitoring from. And it's nice to be able to have the two side by side, or if you needed to go in and change some settings in here. So one of the things I did is, because Dante is my master clock, I've got it set to the I/O port. And for some reason, it keeps flashing between checkmark and bad, but the sound quality itself is fine. And I think that's maybe because I've got the Dante card set to 48 kilohertz, and it's using the sample rate converter, the asynchronous sample rate converter in that card, because the AHM, like the SQ and all the other current Allen and Heath stuff, operates at 96 kilohertz internally. If I set it to unit internal, I get a solid green for the sync lock, but I get clicks, which is the kind of thing you expect when you are not synced. And when I have it set to the I/O port, sync is fine. There's no clicks or anything like that. Controllers. Here you can see, the unit is the GPIO on the back. You've got a level sensing thing where you can make triggers that happen when here's the front panel controls, right? So here, set it to call preset 1, and we will get to the IP8 a bit later, right? Manage lets you create presets and so forth, and I've only got one in here because I'm not really doing complicated deployment right now. Channels is the same thing as this other window, and then assign lets you map all of your Dante or other inputs and outputs, and so we'll go through that in a bit. So how does the AHM process stuff, right? You have input row strips, and you have output strips. You can also group stuff together. I have not made any groups. And you can also do IP is input processor direct outs. And again, the way you would configure that is in the Patchbay. You would go and you'd say, I want to configure the direct outs, and I want to send them to the I/O, or you could send to the local. And here, I want to send the direct outs. And now you could then adjust the send levels over here in the direct outs view. And on the monitor, as I was showing, you have the monitoring here, right? So if I'm on an input, you can see it bouncing around. But the monitor, you can also send out. And so, for example, I have it outputting on channels 63 and 64. You can also do tie lines. And tie lines, again, you can select which source you want to send and then what output. And so, for example, I have SigGen 1, signal generator 1, going to output 62. So again, I can have other devices subscribe, and that's an easy way to make sure you got levels, and it's a known level, because again, with the tie line, there's no processing in there going on. It's just the SigGen's raw level. And you can configure the signal generators where I've system unit signal generators. So signal generator 1, for example, here is sine wave, and you can specify the frequency. And one thing you'll note, I've got it set to a gain of 0. And this is one of the things that threw me for a little while, because I was assuming that the AHM is using digital gain. And so we would expect 0 to be maximum. but it's not. It's actually representing stuff more like an analog desk would, where 0 in the digital scale is -18 dB. And so you can see it goes up to 15, and then you got a little bit more up here with the dark red, and that would go to 18. And so that'll come in, that'll be relevant in a bit when we talk about things like the compressor and whatnot, because I had all my compressor settings wrong because I was thinking digital compressor instead of, and same thing for the limiters. And so it was outputting stuff much quieter than I expected it to. And I'm like, what's going on here? Until I realized, wait a minute, why does it have such a big bar above 0? Usually digital meters only show like +3 because you can't really go any higher than that. You clip, and the +3 is just to show you true peak is peaking over in your clipping, right? So input strips, right? So on the input strips, first thing you can do is say, hey, what's my source? So this is the mic is on that you're listening to me on is on IO port input 1. So Dante input 1, that is coming from the announcer's console, as I said before. And if you watch my video about using the announcer's console with Dante for digital insert, the voice you're hearing me through is actually going through a Cedar DNS 8D dialogue noise suppressor. And what's happening is the announcer's console is sending the raw mic to the DNS, to the Cedar. Cedar is processing it, sending it back to the Dante mic input on the announcer's console. And then the announcer's console's main out is then sent to wherever, and it's got the clean feed. And if I initiate one of the talkback channels, then the talkbacks get the clean feed as well. So we can do a trim here again. So if we needed to raise or lower it on any of the inputs, you can do that. Next step is a gate. And I'm not really a fan of the gate sound, right? Because everybody, even people who are not really sound people, will hear and pick up on when the gate is on and when it's off, because it's so noticeable where you have silence, or even if you're doing a mild decrease in volume, they still pick up on that, right? And so the gate here is really more of a just make sure that when it's really quiet, it's dead quiet, right? So threshold is down at -50 with a depth of 60, which is the max. And that just says when it's really quiet out, nuke everything. But if there's even a little bit of noise or sound coming through, then you don't want to have the gate kick in, because that just is really noticeable. People pick up on it and they don't really like it. You can also configure this as a ducker and then choose what your side channel is. It is, in this mode where I've got it as a gate with the side channel turned on, basically it's saying, hey, ignore any of the low stuff, so room rumble or whatever, don't pay attention to that when you're evaluating the threshold. Next in the input chain, you got insert point A, and you can send inserts to either local analog outs or to IO outs. It's one of the reasons why the Dante card has so many more channels than the system can actually process, because you can send stuff out and back in on inserts, and that's separate from your input processing channel inputs or tie lines, etc., right? So a lot of flexibility there. Then you have a parameter EQ, and this has got 8 points, right? You can click on them to switch between them. You can set various types for them. And on myself, I've got, again, a high pass or a low cut, however you want to call it, at 80 hertz. You don't get to actually set the roll off or the steepness of that like you do, like if you want to set the Q and whatnot for others. But again, that's just to make sure that some of that low end rumble, if it makes it through, gets knocked out. I also have a notch down here, or not really notch, but a fairly narrow Q bell for getting rid of some of the sibilance. This is one of the reasons why I wanted to have an EQ for my stuff, because being able to pull out some of the sibilance, etc., is handy to do, and I haven't been able to do that with just the Digiface Dante. And then the other thing I do is, again, a low pass or a high cut, starting at 12K, where again, you don't get to set the roll off, but it is what it is. And again, that's just to make sure that any high-end hiss or whatever in the room goes not there, right? You can take this preset and you can copy it, or you can copy this setting for the, and this works for all of the tools, right? They all have these copy to, copy from, and library buttons. So you could send this to any, or multiple outputs if you want, or sorry, multiple inputs if you want. You can also copy from another one. So if you want to import a setting, that's really easy to do. You can also go to library and you can save and recall presets. Next in the input line is a compressor. And again, here I've got really gentle settings. So again, threshold is at 0, which again in the digital realm is -18 with a fairly mild ratio. This is just to make sure that, you know, I don't really tend to get super excited when I'm talking into the mic, but you never know, and it will sort of gently tame that a little bit. And there's no really need for makeup gain in this configuration, so the makeup gain is set at 0, right? You can toggle any of these things in and out, so you're not really going to hear a whole lot, because as you can see, it's not actually having to compress. And also down here, this is a history of the compressor. So if I talk really loud, you can see it compressed a little bit there. But again, the goal here is to be mostly natural sounding and not have it kill stuff, right? Because people will pick up on when things don't quite sound right. And for normal voice, you don't really need a lot of compression. They give you a second insert point after the compressor. They give you a delay option with a couple of different ways to specify it. So if you're trying to sync up people that are different distances from different microphones or whatever, or you need to make it line up with a video recorder or whatever, you can add delay for any individual channel. Then you have the AMM, right? So this is the Allen Heath auto mixer. And on the AHM-32, they give you four of them, right? You can actually come over here and say how many to enable. If I say just 2, then each of these would end up having the ability to have up to 8 up to 16 channels in them, right? If you set it to just 1, you could run an auto mixer across all 32. Default is 4, and I only need the 1. I haven't set it. And what I've got is I've got the auto mixer set for the first 3 inputs, which are the 3 announcers consoles. And that way, if I've got somebody here, a guest, we're sitting in the same room, you're going to have a little bit of the mic bleed between us, and this will help take care of that without me having to sit there and ride the faders, right? Very handy. Finally, you have sort of the master level output for the input channel. And here I've got them all basically set at unity of 0. And then this last bit is what they call X-point routing, because you can send an input to 1 or more output zones. And I'll show an example of that. So I've got, input 1 is my announcer's console with my mic, this Shure SM7B. And then I've got 2 other announcers consoles that I can bring the inputs in. I have them basically set up the same way. I didn't dial in that sibilance notch, because different people, you're going to want to configure that for the individual speaker. So, and then the other inputs, I just sort of copied down a few ones to pre-populate in the case I needed to do something else. And then down at the end of the inputs, I've done a couple of things. So I've got this playback input, and the playback input source is coming from the internal playback engine in the AHM. And I can trigger playback. And you can hear that, and I'm going to cancel it. And, you know, so you can do an intro song, an outro sound, you know, sound effects, whatever you want. Again, not necessarily super convenient because there's not a built-in control panel other than those 8 buttons on the front, which in an installed, you know, it's probably in a rack in a back room somewhere that people aren't really going to be touching. You can also do events, you can have triggers, so you can fire off sound effects in a number of ways besides just a button press. But I got this playback channel as an input, and that'll be important because when we get to the crosspoint, multiple crosspoint. And then also I have that signal generator, and that signal generator you can actually see here, I have it set to both output zones, and it's currently muted, and I can unmute it, and you'll hear that. And the other thing that's going on, and we'll see this in a moment, is I've got it set to duck both the signal generator and the playback when I am talking on the main mic. And I can also unmute that on the guests channel and do sound check on the guest channel as well. And both of, you know, so this signal generator is going to both of these outputs, and you can see that the signal generator is always on at a constant level. So let's look at the output chains now. So as I said, I've got 2 zones. You can actually have quite a few more zones, up to 32, obviously. And then when you can configure which ones you want to be stereo and which ones you want to be mono, albeit it's always even number spacing. So if you wanted this to be mono, you're going to get 2 mono channels no matter what. And then the other thing you can do is you can reduce the number of zones. And you do that for one of 2 reasons. One is so that you just have less clutter in the window over here. And then secondly, if you wanted to do speaker processing, so you can do 2, 3, and 4-way speaker processing if you're driving separate subs and line arrays and so forth. And in order to do speaker processing, you have to quote unquote reserve some channels, some output channels for the speaker processing. So if I was to select I wanted 4-way on here, I would need at least 4 processing channels, which means I'd have to have at least 4 zones turned off as well, right? So zone name is just name. You can also color your zones. Then you have selector, and I'm not doing a selector here, but a selector lets you create something where users can pick different inputs and then have those inputs feed through the rest of the zone output processing. And so it'll basically, any of the inputs that are routed to the zone, if you have a selector on it, it allows you to pick which of those to send through and the others get blocked. With no selector, all inputs sending to the zone feed through. And they sell like little hardware, so like a little spinny wheel that you could mount in a 1U J box next to, you know, on the wall somewhere or whatever. So again, installed sound, they're thinking you're putting these things in a wall because it's a conference room or whatever, reception area, doing music, plus you need a paging overhead, whatever the case might be, you might want to be able to have a different selector. Next on the zone input is a thing they call priority inputs. And this is where that ducking I talked about comes in, right? So I've said the priority input from the 3 channels going into this zone is my mic. And then on the configuration, you can say what to do, right? So threshold is -20. If I'm talking and I'm above -20, and again, keep in mind that all of this is, not digital scale. This is the old analog scale. When I am talking, it's going to reduce the other channels on this zone, so the signal generator and the playback, by 12 dB, and it's got a release time of 50 dB a second. So when I stop talking, it will gradually bring that back up instead of it being abrupt. So a little bit more smooth sounding. Here we can see the X-point routing input, right? So we've got in this case, my channel, we've got the two signal generator, we got the signal generator, we got playback, and all of these are coming in, and you can define what you want to include and so forth. And you could basically select everything and have everything come into this zone as an output if you wanted. Zones get an insert as well. We talked about the mechanism for that. Zones have another 8-channel parameter EQ. And then they have this graphic EQ, which you can also run as another 8-channel parametric EQ if you want. And also on the graphic, it's giving you some RTA of, the red is where's the highest frequency range and how much energy is out there, right? Similar to this assigned monitoring, although this has a little bit more detail because it's broken into more channels and so forth. The output also has its own compressor. So again, if you're feeding a bunch of inputs into a zone output, you might want to do an overall compressor on them. You've got delay again. You've got automatic noise compensation, which is kind of a cool feature where you can have, so the usual example here is you're a restaurant and you want to have background music playing in the restaurant. And as more people are in the restaurant and talking, the ambient level comes up. And so that background music in effect gets lost to the ambient noise of everybody talking. So what you can do is you can assign one of your input channels, right, as something to monitor this meter point, right? So you can choose wherever you want to meter it from. This is also defaulting to the first thing, which is the mic I'm on now, which, you would probably actually be setting this to some other input if you were doing this for real. And you set min gain, max gain, rate of change, threshold to start kicking in, time settings, etc. And basically what happens is it listens on the input you specify here. And again, you can do all of the same input processing on whatever you're feeding into this as you would on any other input. And so as the ambient noise gets louder, it will bring the level of, say, your background music up as well. Or maybe you may need a paging service, paging output to make sure that it's loud enough that people can hear it over the ambient noise. So you might want to bring that pager zone output up and down based on how loud the ambient noise is, but you don't want it to be like blasting everybody when the place is empty and you don't have all that ambient noise. Next, you have sort of the master output level, as well as when you're on a stereo zone, you can adjust the balance. And then you get into speaker processing, where again, you can set that for, hey, I have subs, I have tweeters, I have mid-range, whatever your setup is, you can do that. The other thing that's not shown at the moment, because I don't have the add-in card for it, is the acoustic echo cancellation. So again, that's something you'd use in like a conference room setting where you have people that dial in and they're talking and then they're playing through speakers in the conference room, and the mics might pick that up, and you don't want to send that back to the callers or whoever the remote people are, whether it's a call or a video conference, whatever. Again, that's an add-on card. The AHM-32 supports that. The AHM-64 supports that. The AHM-16 does not. So if you need acoustic echo cancellation for a conference room, you are looking at a 32 or a 64. Then finally, you have the outputs as well as a limiter. And so the outputs are fairly straightforward. You pick on a stereo channel what your left and right out are, and we saw that earlier in the Dante mapping. You can reverse the polarity on them if you need. And then you also have a limiter, which is kind of nice. And this is a fairly, this is the CYA for making sure you don't get too loud. And again, here, keep in mind that the scale is all based on analog metering rather than digital metering. So this threshold of 15, which seems really high, is really effectively minus 3 dB on the digital scale. And you can see it's going to clip off pretty hard when it hits that. And you can turn on and off again, like everything else. You can copy to, copy from. You can adjust the attack time and the release on the limiter, etc. Right? And these are obviously set very fast. And so that's kind of it. Now, the thing I do with the guests is I don't do separate zones for each guest. Instead, again, I make use of that cross-point routing. I have both guest channels coming into this guest's output zone. I can, again, also have the signal generator in here if I want to test the output from this zone. And it's going through, it's got its own level of control with mute and so forth. And then again, routes to output 3. And again, the limiter is set up as a safety net for making sure you don't ever clip. And so if we go back, so that's an overview of how I've set it up. And like I say, this is a really simple setup at the moment. I got way more capacity on here than I actually need. It is what it is, but it's handy to be able to now finally be able to do things like set up EQ and dynamics on each of the inputs as needed. Now, the other thing that I've got is this IP8 controller, which is over here. And you can define, so the unit, this is again, it's referring to things that are physically on the AHM itself. They sell these IP1s, which, as I said, are the spinny knob, and then also you can press the button to be a click. So you can say, hey, do that input selector, click to select. You can also have push the main button and just have a couple of toggles again. So like you could set this up and you could say, hey, when they press that button, I am going to change any one of these different things, right? And you can do, so this is the button press. I'm sorry, I had them backwards. That previous selection was when you're spinning the knob. This selection is what do you want to do when you press the button. So you could, hey, press the button and activate a preset select, which, so you might have, hey, I want to listen to music, or I want to listen to somebody speaking in the other room, or whatever, right? You can also do source zone select, right? Similar concept. The IP6 is a 6-dial, so it's in effect 6 IP1s plus a couple extra knobs, so you can do mutes and configure them however you want, right? And then you have the IP8, which is the most advanced of their controllers. There is also technically this GPIO unit, which is just 8 in, 8 out GPIOs. So maybe you need something in a different room to trigger, a slide, trigger a screen for a projector to go up and down, right? You can do that. That's some of the more advanced programming in the AHM, but that's what you might use GPIO for. And here again is IP8. Again, they let you have up to 8 with the AHM-32. If you were on the 16, they let you have up to 4 of them. You can name them. You can give them static IP and so forth, right? You basically program the controller via the AHM instead of directly on the controller, because there's no inputs on it for you to do things like select IP. And in here, you configure all the stuff that you want any way you want, right? So I've got this first one is input 1 level, input 2 level, input 3 level. I've got a couple of blanks, and then I've got the zone level for me. I've got the zone level for guests. I've got the input level for the playback channel, right? And that also influences what you see on the displays. You can see on the screen, it's got them. And actually what I'm going to do is I'm going to open the simulation and I'll drag it up here. And the thing that is pretty cool is that if I click to mute, you can see that it also turned on the mute on the physical controller itself, right? So, or if I drag this slider, you can see the slider is also moving on the IP8 because it's a motorized slider. And so I can come down here and I'll say, hey, I want -6. These buttons simulate the same buttons on the side. So these are typically used as layer selects, although you could do, and again, any button press action you want with them. I have 3 layers. I have this top layer. The second layer just has inputs 1 through 8 straight across. This bottom layer is a little separate because you've got playback channel here, so I can have a bit more direct control over that. I've got control over the signal generator, so if I wanted to drag the signal generator up or down a bit, I can, right? And it's really not wanting there, -6. And then again, too, you can see one thing that's unfortunate is you can't put labels on these buttons, right? So even though I've got this button, if I go down here to the layer and I select this button, you can see it's set to playback track 1, which, there it goes, stop playing it. And the button will turn blue when it's playing, but it won't like display anything on the screen, which is unfortunate. I really wish they had implemented something to that effect. You can set different actions for press versus release. And if you normally want normal behavior, you just leave releases unused. But if you wanted to do something like, hey, hold this button down to talk to a paging channel, and then when you let go, it goes back to no, you're not speaking anymore. You would say, hey, on press, I'm going to activate that paging channel, and then on release, you're going to unselect that paging channel. And then you can also control what the LED does, so you can have it be follow the action, but you can also say, you know what, I just want it to be a static color or whatever, right? So you got a lot of programming flexibility here. If I go to the layer 2, you can see again, I've just got all the inputs 1 and 2. You can see the buttons here, layer 1, because this is the layer change on button press, layer 2, layer 3. One thing you got to keep in mind is that if you create a layer change that says go from layer 1 to layer 2, on layer 2, you got to make sure there's a layer change back to layer 1, otherwise you're stuck on layer 2, right? So you got to think about the planning for how you assign these buttons. But they're really quite powerful, and you can do a lot of fancy things. So like by changing calling presets, and with preset recall controls, which you can actually define for every preset, you can say, here's a preset that changes the layout of the IP8 to whatever a secondary mode is. And the only thing it recalls is that one IP8 controller. You can get into some pretty complex stuff where they hit a button, it's on mode 1, hit a button, it's on mode 2, totally reconfigured. All the sliders do something entirely different, whatever you want it to be. And that there are a few videos about that on YouTube, but that's a pretty advanced thing. I'm not going to try to show that off right now. Mainly what I wanted to demonstrate is just how powerful this configuration is. You can do anything you want with any of the buttons, and it's really handy. And it's nice to have a tactile surface for when you are doing stuff. Now, if it's just me in here, I usually have it set pretty static. I don't, I'll put the IP8 away so it's not sitting out taking up space. But if I'm doing something where I am going to have guests in here, then, you know, it's handy to have this because now I have sliders for me, myself, and each of the guests. So that's been a look at what the AHM-32 can do with Dante and an IP8 controller. I hope that this has been helpful. Like I say, I'm just scratching the surface on what this thing can do here. But if you got any questions, please leave them down in the comments below, and I will try to get back to you as soon as I can. Thanks. Cheers.